Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Archival Discourses. This week I'll be picking up from the last stream I did the previous Tuesday, where I was reading through the 60-year Caucasian War by Rostislav Fediev on the Russian conquest of the Caucasus. So we're going to pick up right where we left off last time. So, it goes without saying that it would have been impossible for even the largest army to advance in this manner. From the circumference to the centre, developing the terrain in all directions, the eastern group of mountains, dominated by Muridism at the time, is about 900 kilometres in circumference. All this mountainous space is so cluttered with ridges, torn by ravines, and clothed with a half-impenetrable forest, such that even on a relief map it is a perfect chaos in which the eye can hardly grasp the main outlines. It would take half a century, if not longer, and the sacrifice of 500,000 soldiers to make the whole country accessible, ridge by ridge, gorge by gorge, overcoming at every step the fierce resistance of the mountaineers. But in spite of its chaotic appearance, this military theatre has, like any other, its strategic lines, the possession of which decides the possession of the known part of the region. The ridges, accessible only in summer, cut the region into practically independent sections. The rivers, cutting through the bottomless abysses of the Caucasus, form lines of the strongest defence. Even the tribal divisions in the mountains form edges as sharp as their natural features, the mutual dislike of the tribes, restrained but not erased by Muridism. Edges that could serve as stages of conquest. Strategic lines existed, but to discern them in such a cluttered terrain alone required the eye of a commander, the likes of whom had not appeared in the Caucasus for a long time. To approach them properly required a perfect knowledge of local warfare. However, if in the course of 18 years, from the time when the main effort was again directed against the eastern Caucasus to the final 3 years of the occupation, no first-class military man capable of conquering the mountains had appeared in the Caucasian army, there were certainly intelligent and extremely experienced generals who could march toward the goal, slowly but surely, and hold back the further onslaught of Muridism. But here is the main drawback of man's power. A full understanding of the present belongs only to the minds of the first rate, which are few in the world. The range of ideas of ordinary people, though intelligent as well as of the masses, is not really determined by the present, but by the period immediately preceding it, which has already had time to articulate, agree on its concepts, and impregnate their general opinion with them. If in the current period something new is formed and develops quickly, intelligent people still approach it with old methods and constantly lag behind the actual state of things. This is exactly what happened in the Caucasus. Yes, I think that's actually very much true. I'm going to draw a meta-political sort of comparison to the current situation in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination, because ultimately the right is only just sort of catching up in the present time with cancelling the left, quote unquote, because about 10 years ago they were, no, we can't get cancelling people. That's wrong and tyrannical. But so one of those eternal laws, it seems, this tactical lag, as Philosophicat likes to say. After Muridism had subjugated the population of the eastern mountains and transformed them into a militant Muslim order, the commanders stationed in the Caucasus did not want to realise for a long time that 20 years of work toward the conquest of this country were gone, that it was necessary to forget about them and start work again as if we had just arrived in the region, that it was impossible not only to act the way General Yermolov did, but even the way General Rosen had acted against the disunited mountaineers in 1832, now that they had emerged into one political whole, that now individual societies cannot submit to a pogrom, even if they wanted to, that the land of unruly mountaineers had to be torn off piece by piece, that the army must establish itself in the occupied area. Considerable forces are necessary for methodical warfare. Yet at that time, they squandered 18 battalions for the Black Sea coastline, which had to be abandoned at the first enemy shot. They allocated means to make strong expeditions beyond the Kuban, which was not the most urgent demand of the Caucasian War, and even in Chechnya and Dagestan, they collected detachments of 10 and 12 battalions of the same strength as the detachments which now have conquered the Caucasus. Behind these detachments, there were not so many reserves as now, it is true, but this lack of reserves was a reason to act more slowly, not a reason to act incorrectly. Unfortunately, the memories of the previous period still weigh too heavily on the decisions of the Caucasus commanders. It was also difficult to admit that the enormous sacrifices made for the conquest of the area had been wasted and that it was necessary to start again. Without admitting it, they redoubled the ferocity of their assault on the mountaineers in order to correct the mistakes of many years at once. The main blows were directed at Shamil personally, at his residences and his promoters, hoping to overthrow Muridism and break his power over the Highlanders. That's a reference to Shamil, who was the leader of the Circassian uprising. But Muridism was no longer a party, it was a state. Our troops met unanimous resistance everywhere. For several years, expeditions to Chechnya, Ichkeria, and countries surrounding Avaria were tirelessly carried out with the aim of forcing the mountain societies to break away from Shamil by ruining their lands. Sometimes the troops penetrated far enough into the enemy's country. Sometimes they encountered insurmountable obstacles from the first steps. But always these expeditions had the same result: a few burnt out huts, costing us several hundred, sometimes several thousand soldiers. Our offensive was incessant but largely innocuous for the Highlanders, who were so emboldened by this that a few dozen men, huddled in their slums, were not afraid to engage a column of several battalions, and answering with one shot to 100 of ours, inflicted a much greater loss on us than we did on them. During these years, it happened more than once that the mountaineers, relying on the fortification of their land, rushed into our borders as we were advancing on them, disturbing the submissive population, and sometimes established themselves in the areas occupied by them. Muridism expanded its stranglehold slowly but constantly, driving us step by step out of the eastern Caucasus. To put an end to this miserable state of affairs, Prince Chernyshov, the former Minister of War, was sent to the Caucasus in 1842. Unfamiliar with the situation of the country, he could not replace one system with another, and in order to stop the constant failures, he stopped military operations altogether. Muridism was given a year's rest, during which it settled in indefinitely. In 1843, the mountaineers themselves rushed from the depths of their gorges, took Avaria and Koisuba from us, despite the fact that the population of these countries bravely supported our cause, exterminated several detachments, took 9 fortifications, and spilled over the whole of Dagestan, but only 2 sites remained in our grip: Tamir Khan, Shura, and Nizhavoye. Although the Caucasian Corps had been constantly reinforced since 1831 by increasing the number of battalions in the regiments and forming 47 new line battalions, in the spring of 1844 we had to move another 40,000 bayonet troops to the Caucasus. This year our troops operated not as detachments, but as entire corps, and yet, strange as it may seem to say, superior morale remained on the side of the mountaineers. The troops were well aware of their superiority, but the commanders were afraid to make up their minds on decisive actions, constantly expecting some extraordinary and crushing manoeuvre from the Murids. The incidents of the 2 preceding years had made them so accustomed to this threat. The events of the Caucasian War had subverted the most plausible expectations to such an extent that at last even experienced men began to consider it an absolutely extraordinary phenomenon, beyond all rules and calculations. However, the main hazard to Russian rule on the Caucasian Isthmus was not so much the insurmountable terrain of the mountains as it was the disposition of the tribes surrounding them. If the force hostile to us had been limited to independent mountaineers, this danger could have been mathematically calculated and sufficient means could always have been used to counter it. But as already been said, the only difference between the submissive and disobedient Muslim tribes was the relative fortitude of their lands. By this alone did they measure their attitude towards us. Every invasion of the Murids was followed by the uprising of the peaceful people, so that in the event of an external war, it was impossible to calculate the extent of the conflagration which might break out at our rear. Every tribe around the Murids not only sympathized with them, but was directed to lend them a hand at the first opportunity. In this respect, the administration of the region was even more flawed than the manner of warfare itself. In Islam, every aspect of the people's public and private life, every relationship, is determined by Sharia. Thus, in a purely Muslim context, any legislation becomes impossible. A law is already established by the unchangeable will of God, and all people, perfectly equal among themselves, are equally obliged to obey it. In practice, there are many violations of this fundamental law in Muslim lands, but the rule is invariable, and Muridism, having subjected everything to the spiritual law without question, has only brought the completion of the doctrine common to all Muslims. The interpreters of the law must naturally be the clergy who learn it, hence the introduction of Sharia law into a country gives full authority to the clergy. It is needless to say that in the Caucasus, the Muslim clergy was secretly devoted to Muridism. This doctrine fulfilled their most intimate convictions and desires. The clergy had no influence under the former tribal system. Mountain and sub-mountain tribes were subordinate either to the rulers, the upper class, or the people's assembly, but in general, they were governed according to the ancient custom, sometimes in a very complicated and harmonious way. In the 1820s, the authorities created by the folk communities were eliminated and the rule of the Sharia began to spread. The Caucasian authorities and Shamil and his followers were equally eager for this. Muridism exerted all efforts to exterminate local rulers and upper classes, to eradicate ancient folk customs that divided and distinguished tribes, placing them with the rule of Sharia and clergy everywhere. So it's interesting, you almost have this sort of traditional like Islamic imposition in a conquest where the whole sort of law kind of just gets like transformed and is submitted to the Sharia. Now there are obviously some exceptions to that. So, with places such as the Arab Caliphates, there would under the Abbasids be adoption of several Persian customs and government, and later the Ottomans would employ several Byzantine or Orthodox customs into their government as well. So it's not everywhere, and perhaps it seems to be only on these like local on like local tribal level, if the whole people are just taken into conversion to Islam. The Russian authorities in the Caucasus did the same in the subjugated societies for a very comprehensible reason. It was easier for them to base the people's government on the Sharia, the written law, than on the unknown tribal customs, which had yet to be clarified and legitimized at a time when there was not even properly organized local authorities in the Caucasus. It was according to this system that Russian hands cultivated the soil on which Muridism was later sown. The teachings of the strict tariqat were spread throughout the Caucasus by persons on the Russian payroll. What could be expected from the population armed and ignorant, to whom the most incendiary ideas were preached daily, while they saw with their own eyes the impotence of Russian arms against Muridism? Naturally, the whole population of the foothills was waiting for any opportunity, and Muridism could nourish the most fantastic hopes. Under these difficult circumstances, the chief commander in the Caucasus was entrusted to the late Prince Emis Vorontsov. It was vested with full authority. The constant failures of the previous campaigns were attributed not to a full system, but to inexperienced commanders. Relying on the high-profile fame of Prince Vorontsov, decisive successes were expected from the moment he set foot in the Caucasus. Prince Vorontsov's initial military venture, the Darga campaign, was planned under the influence of these expectations and was executed on the model of previous expeditions, only on a larger scale. This was also the last venture of its kind. The lesson was sufficient. A campaign undertaken into the mountains of a numerous and superior army, supplied with all possible means, inspired by the personal leadership of a famous and authorized general, ended with the loss of 5,000 men and 3 guns without the slightest gain. From this point on, a change took place in the Caucasian War. It cannot be said that Prince Vorontsov replaced the former puzzling expeditions with a coherent system fully applicable to the present situation. During his administration, the offensive was systematically carried out in only one corner of the military theatre, on the Chechen plain. There, for the first time under Muridism, a positive result was achieved. By a well-considered and steadily executed felling of the forests, the hostile population was driven out of Lesser Chechnya, and the development of Greater Chechnya began. In other parts of the enemy's land, in Dagestan, the Vladikavkaz district, and on the Lezgin line, expeditions were still tentative, attempts made without a firmly defined goal. It is impossible to say, even with the greatest desire, that the sieges of Gurgabil, Saltov, and Chokha, or the campaigns to Dzermut and Kapucha, were links in any greater system or steps that would move us in a positive direction. All this aside, the course of action undertaken by Prince Vorontsov was imbued with one common idea, and did in fact bring about a beneficial change in the Caucasian War. The principal feature of this course of action was that we temporarily abandoned the conquest of the mountains, which we had so persistently and vainly sought before, without, however, refusing to take advantage of circumstances whenever possible. We began to conduct our expeditions cautiously, not far from our borders, without exposing the active troops to great danger. The Caucasian Corps, reinforced on the departure of the 5th Infantry Corps by a new division of 20 battalions, became tighter around the mountains because the troops were no longer diverted to the far end of the region or deep into the enemy's land. The unruly mountaineers saw an iron will encircling them, and thus the victories and the spread of Muridism were put to an end, which was the great merit of Prince Vorontsov. Of course, more could have been done in 10 years. Yet carried away by old memories once again, by fear of the extraordinary successes the Murids had achieved in the past, we let our concerns overtake us, and became desperate to break the mountaineers right away. We took fortresses at a high price, losing a whole summer and several thousand soldiers for the siege, and then abandoned them. Meanwhile, half of the detachment used for the siege could have defeated the mountaineers without loss if they had fought invading our borders. Again, reason was guided by our understanding of the preceding period, not the current one. Nevertheless, the close 10-year imposition had its effect on the recalcitrant mountaineers, although the hostile disposition of the mountain population was by no means weakened, because the incendiary rule of the Sharia and the influence of the clergy had meanwhile been definitively systematized. Fanaticism had lost some of its vague hopes, but was constituted half of its strength. The rebels, locked up hopelessly in their mountains, could no longer think of driving us from the Caucasus by their own forces, and their fervour cooled. The force of Muridism seeped away, its champions became significant people and took the place of the aristocracy which they had slaughtered in the 1830s. Shamil, growing accustomed to the position of an Asiatic sultan, forced the mountain societies to recognise his son as heir and considered founding a ruling house. Desperate vengeance no longer attracted the aging knights of Muridism. The people at first devoted with all their souls to the new doctrine became so cold to it when they experienced in practice the monstrous despotism of the government, which had once been promised to them as the ideal of earthly life. The passion passed away little by little, but it was replaced by habit and the extraordinary development of political power based on Muridism. The material resources of the mountaineers increased enormously. They already had excellent fortresses, gunpowder factories, boundaries, replacing the fervour of the fanatical crowd with a social and military system. The Eastern Caucasus, like Proteus, changed its appearance every decade, remaining equally invulnerable to our weapons. By the end of Prince Vorontsov's administration, military operations were taking place exclusively on the Chechen plain. While the current commander-in-chief, Prince Baratinsky, was in charge, there we were, moving forward, gradually opening up Greater Chechnya by siftings. It was also here that we laid the foundation for a reasonable management of the native population, based on tribal identity, with the elimination where possible of the spiritual element. But the actions of the commander of the left flank were limited, both by the insufficiency of means and of the subordinate nature of his position. For the rest of the hostile frontiers, the troops stood, one might say, gun at their feet, not daring to act, but so too not daring to weaken themselves by a single company so as to not give Muridism any breathing room. The idea of conquering the mountains, at first postponed indefinitely, began to disappear altogether, even in the minds of people who had devoted their lives to war in the Caucasus. By the beginning of the 1850s, the very few people who believed in the possibility of defeating Muridism surprised but did not convince anyone with their words. The 50-year struggle on the Caucasian Isthmus led to the empire chaining the whole army to the eastern group of mountains, removing it not only from Russia's total forces, but even from the number of mobile forces in the Caucasus, with no foreseeable conclusion ahead. In 1853, an external war broke out. Up to that time, the struggle against Muridism had taken place in the midst of a profound peace, which enabled the empire to dispose of its forces freely. Then, for the first time, the question which had long troubled far-sighted men became a reality. What would be our position when the Caucasian Corps would have to withstand the onslaught of external forces in the internal war that had assumed such enormous proportions? The question was solved by the prowess of the Caucasian troops, which several times defeated armies 4 or 5 times stronger than any regular army. However, during the 3-year war, he's referring to the Crimean War, so it's interesting, isn't it? Because you can draw a comparison with the earlier Russo-Persian wars, where, especially in the First War, where Russia was unable to decisively beat the Persians in a quick war because of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. They had to keep diverting forces away from the front. So it was only really after the failure of Napoleon's 1812 campaign that the Russians were able to finally defeat the Persians in 1813. The fate of Russian rule in the Caucasus frequently hung in the balance. The Caucasian troops had to face both sides, meeting with the enemy from north and south in the midst of a population awaiting the first success of their co-religionists. The obsolete leaders of Muridism did not do anything decisive at this time, though they could have and probably would have if our defensive lines on their side had been weakened. Overconfidence could have been our undoing. One need only remember 1843. Although the Caucasian troops were reinforced during the war by 4 divisions, and their number expanded to 270,000 armed men, capable with their superior quality of breaking any European enemy, the necessity of containing the internal enemy absorbed all the forces of the Caucasian Corps to such an extent that on the battlefield to Turkey, the fate of the war was decided by 9 battalions in 1853 and 17 battalions in 1854. These detachments had to fight in a ratio of 1 against 5 and to win at all costs. because with Muradism in the rear, there was no retreat. Even an unresolved affair would have all the consequences of total defeat for us. The troops which operated on the Caucasian frontier from 1853 to 1855 were strong in spirit and confidence, but so weak in numbers that even a small increase of the enemy, an easy feat for the Allied army, would invariably have tipped the scales in the Allies' favour. Now, after the fall of Shamil, we can say frankly that in spite of a number of truly unparalleled feats, we retained the Caucasus only because France, which had possessed the dominant land forces in the previous war, was alien to the Asiatic question and had no interest in dislodging us from the Caucasus. Furthermore, when the British army was increased in 1856 to such a size that it could begin independent action, the sudden peace put an end to its enterprises. Given the situation that Muradism created for us in the Caucasus, it was more than doubtful that in 1855 or 1856, out of the 270,000 armed men that made up the Caucasian Corps, it would be possible to safely separate forces sufficient to repel a 50,000 strong European landing in the winter of 1855 to 56 over a period of 3 months. They could not muster enough troops to give battle to Omar Pasha, who had invaded Mingrelia with 25,000 Turks. The war had made clear the position of Russian power in the Caucasus, as well as many other things in the empire. After such an example, it was no longer possible to consider the Caucasian struggle as a local affair, the influence of which extended over to one corner of the Russian possessions. In fact, it turned out that this struggle robbed the state of half of the active force it could have had at its disposal for foreign warfare. Of the 270,000 troops, they were immovably chained to the Caucasus from 1854 to 56. The defence of the Caucasus from external enemies, including all garrisons of frontier fortresses, numbered hardly 70,000. The remaining 200,000 were fruitless sacrifice cut off from the state by Muradism. With the high cost of sustaining troops in the Caucasus, these 200,000 were equal to at least 300,000 in Russia, i.e. almost the whole mass of our active forces, consisting of the Guards, Grenadiers, Reserve Cavalry and 6 Army Corps. Moreover, these 200,000 soldiers and Cossacks were not militia or reserve battalions, of which any number can be recruited so long as they serve only for the internal defence of the region. They were first-rate soldiers, the very element that we lacked in the Crimean War, and which the Allies had in 20,000 Algerian soldiers deciding everything. The absence of such a mass of select troops from the war, their theatre, reduced the actual strength of the Russian Empire to that of a state not with 70 million, but with 30 million inhabitants. What was the ultimate result of this immense sacrifice? That 270,000 troops were insufficient for the defence of the Caucasus in external war, as long as armed Muradism stood in the middle of it. After such an experience, there could be no more hesitation. The Russian Empire could not abandon the Caucasus without giving up half of its history, both past and future. Therefore, it had to take advantage of the peace to subdue the mountaineers as soon as possible. The necessity of the immediate conquest of the mountains was realized, but this realization did not make the task itself any easier. The Caucasian War consumed so many troops, it passed through so many systems that were satisfactory on paper, but turned out to be completely untenable in practice, that there was no room for doubt. To end the war, it was not mere manpower or military plans, no matter how well drawn up, that was necessary. It was a commander. All that remained was to find him. And that is the end of the section 2 on Muradism. So, so that section was largely on the kind of a guerrilla war that's being waged by the Circassians against the Russians. But now we've got the second main part of this book, which is called The Conquest of the Caucasus. So this is when Boyatynsky takes over, and he's able to crush the uprising within about 3 years. With the end of the international war, the Tsar elected Adjutant General Prince A.I. Boyatynsky, who had been prepared for this position by his long and active service in the Caucasus, as commander-in-chief of the separate Caucasian Corps, in addition to the forces of the after some time rebranded as an army, the 13th and 18th Infantry Divisions were left at the disposal of the new commander-in-chief, along with 3 newly formed dragoon regiments. Since 1856, the government had maintained a constant supply of forces and material means, in the Caucasus sufficient for the persistent conduct of the war. The Caucasian army and the Caucasian population accepted the appointment of Prince Boyatynsky with unanimous joy. Anyone who was then in the Caucasus will not forget the kind of festivity which erupted all over the country as the news spread. The general feeling is quite understandable in this case. The appointment of Prince Boyatynsky was a natural appointment, which the whole Caucasus desired and expected. The peculiarity of this country, so different from other parts of the empire, as well as of the exceptional character of the troops occupying it and trained in it, have long manifested themselves as harshness and an independence which one must fully understand to rule wisely in the Caucasus. God alone knows all the consequences that occurred from the introduction of ideas a priori into the management of the Caucasus and the conduct of the Caucasian War by people who needed to learn on the job. Irrespective of Prince Baryatinsky's personality, which had long been highly esteemed, the Caucasus trusted him as its own man who knew both people and matters and could take up the task directly. His appointment as Commander-in-Chief made a deep impression on the troops, on the people, and on the unruly mountains. The newspaper Caucasus was filled with joyful reviews from all parts of the country. Among other things, it reported 200,000 Caucasian soldiers considered the appointment of Prince Baryatinsky as a reward for their service. Abandoned in a land quite unlike the rest of Russia, placed in exceptional circumstances, they had to forge a peculiar personality, yet no man will regret the experience. When the personality he forms has the following features, that a Caucasian soldier in the Tsar's service does not consider death or victory as the last degree of a warrior's energy, that he will swear to his commander to win and fulfill his oath, at least against an enemy 4 times stronger than himself, because he does not consider anyone stronger than himself as long as a weapon is in his hands. But the more developed and the more peculiar the personality of a Caucasian soldier, the more important it is for him to be under the hand of a superior who understands him. That is why, when the news of the appointment of Prince Baryatinsky as commander of our corps spread, old servicemen at all ends of the Caucasus told their young comrades, "Look, a prayer to God and service to the Tsar are never wasted." At the same time, for the first time since the beginning of the Mountain War, the Imam of Muradism, alarmed by the general popular apprehension, sent out an announcement to the tribes that the Russians were going to conquer all the mountains in 2 years, and that the time had come when every true Muslim must lay down his life for the faith. This is not at all what the mountaineers thought when the former commanders-in-chief were appointed, or better to say, they did not think about it at all, caring little in the midst of their strongholds who was in charge of the Russians. Life experience often confirms that great events are in fact foretold by a shadow that looms ahead of them, which the masses, always gifted with a marvellous instinct, already feel. While the most advanced people are yet to notice anything, such was the case when Prince Baryatinsky was appointed Commander-in-Chief. Until then, the idea of conquering the mountains had only glimmered as a possibility in the indefinitely distant future. When the new Commander-in-Chief took charge, the troops marched on with the idea that they were now making not one of countless expeditions, but beginning the conquest of the mountains. Meanwhile, an anxious expectation of decisive events spread among the unruly population. I do not know why such a general mood took possession of the region. The military fame of Prince Baryatinsky was not then sufficiently established to inspire such confidence, but it was so. Simultaneously with his appointment, Prince Baryatinsky requested a new division of military commands in the Caucasus. Until then, they existed in the same form as they were established before, Muradism, meeting the needs of a completely different era when the purpose of military action was only to protect our borders or punish independent predatory societies. Since then, the tribes of the Eastern Caucasus had merged into one political body, and the enemy, surrounded by a network of small commanders, had become stronger than each of the military leaders opposing him, so that the opposite was the case: unity on the enemy's side and the fragmentation of ours. Embarking on decisive action, it was necessary to entrust power to an independent commander in each independent military theatre. In August 1856, 5 commanders of troops were established according to the natural division of the Caucasus, vested with the rights of corps commanders. There were 2 against the Adaigs of the Western Caucasus, the commander of the right flank on the northern side of the mountains, and the Governor-General of Kutaisi on the southern side. Against the Murids of the eastern group, there were 3, on the northern slope, the commander of the left flank, to whom Chechnya, former left flank, the Vladikavkaz district, and Kabardia, former centre, were subordinated, another in Dagestan, to whom the whole Caspian region was entrusted, and the third on the Lesgin line on the southern side of the mountains, facing Georgia. This division was involuntary. Each of the designated large divisions was delineated by nature itself, having its own sharply different climatic and local conditions, and in front of itself a different enemy and separate military theatre which local troops had to develop for embarking on collective actions. The Commander-in-Chief could not conduct operations himself when they were of local character. He had to leave the execution of his plan to his assistants, success hinging on their talent and energies. The choice of corps commanders for the Caucasian theatre was even more difficult than for the European, because their actions were more in independent. The personality of men was, in this case, a matter of special importance. The first assistant to the commander-in-chief was, of course, the chief of the army's main staff. Prince Boyatynsky invited General Milutin to this post, who, although he had not yet occupied any high office, had already acquired general fame as an excellent officer, as a writer and the creator of military statistics, which he had elevated to the rank of a science for the first time. Besides the extremely difficult position of chief of the main staff of such a motley army as the Caucasian army, General Milutin was also entrusted with bringing into line the new military administration of the Caucasus, which only the general features had been outlined by the establishment of the troop commanders. In terms of military administration, it was possible to recount almost all the years of Russian rule in the Caucasus by the various institutions that existed, each expressing the character and needs of a different era. General Milutin developed a new system of military administration with such completeness and structure that it will remain a monument to the present Caucasian leadership for a long time. The new administrative system, which has not yet been completed in all its elements due to the vastness of the work, has already grasped the main issues, laid the foundation for reasonable management of the mountaineers, and by distributing the institutions according to the actual needs of the region, began to replace the former unity of arbitrary bureaucracy, which had been spread over the most diverse country in the world, with a living, adaptable organisation. The foundation and example for the new system was the management of the Chechen people, arranged by Prince Boyatynsky when he was chief of the left flank, a system already justified by experience. The accomplishment of this truly statesmanlike work, in which General Milutin was the only assistant to the commander-in-chief, could not be slowed down either by campaigns or by his countless other occupations. General Milutin's labours and actions earned him a rare position, the universal respect of the army and the region without the slightest shade of opinion. According to the Commander-in-Chief's plan, the most extensive and difficult military operations were to be undertaken by the commander of the left flank troops, General, now Adjutant General and Count Yevdokimov, who was appointed to the post. Together with the new division of the Caucasus, the forested Chechnya was a classic land of failure, not to say defeat, experienced at the hands of the mountaineers, but conquest was to begin here. Our troops were to penetrate deep into this land at a time when Muradism still stood at its full strength. Under these conditions, the plan of the commander-in-chief could only succeed with a perfectly faultless execution. The local terrain was everywhere. The terrain of the Icarian and Dargin expeditions, one awkward step would have led to the same results, and a considerable failure on our part, only one would have again postponed the conquest of the mountains for an indefinite time. Count Yevdokimov executed the plans of the commander-in-chief with rare perfection. It can be said positively that not once during the 3-year war did he allow the Highlanders to engage us where they wanted or where it could be beneficial to them. When undertaking the riskiest ventures, Count Yevdokimov always managed to solve the matter with clever manoeuvres, calmly finishing the proposed work and forcing the mountain hordes to disperse without a fight, which more than anything lowered the morale of the enemy. His system of action, in which not the bayonet but the axe was the main instrument of conquest, but necessity burdened the troops with excessive labour and caused them the same loss from disease as they had previously suffered from fire. But the psychological effect of this loss is quite different. When the head is taken off, one does not weep for the hair, and the Caucasus was now subdued. The former pre-Caspian commander, Adjutant General Prince Orbeliani, an experienced general who enjoyed the confidence and love of the troops, was left in charge. A year later, Prince Orbeliani received another appointment and surrendered his post to Adjutant General Baron Wrangel, who was to finish the work of Count Yevdokimov, and in his final campaign, under personal leadership of the Commander-in-Chief, to inflict fatal blows to Muradism. The commander of the Letskin line was appointed to the brave Baron Revsky, who laid down his life in this war and had taken over on his death by the young but inexperienced General Prince Melekov. I limit this overview of commanders to the subject of this work, the Eastern Caucasus. The selection and distribution of the chief commanders, perfectly adapted to the nature of their actions, ensure the precise execution of the commander-in-chief's plan. The main effort was directed against the eastern mountains for reasons already stated. This part of the Caucasus cut off our rear, constantly threatening communications, and at the same time served as a fortress for Muradism, providing a base on which it could stir the obedient Muslim population into constant agitation. The eastern mountain constituted the main danger and the main obstacle to Russian rule on the Caucasian Isthmus. Prince Boyatynsky left a limited force in the western Caucasus, sufficient to gradually develop access to the mountains to perform all preparatory work by the time the war in the eastern Caucasus reached its conclusion. Then all available forces were moved against the latter. The plan for the conquest of the eastern Caucasus, conceived by Prince Boyatynsky long before his appointment as commander-in-chief, was executed in 3 years, word for word and line for line, as perhaps a military plan has never been executed before. The wisdom of his foresight, self-evident to those who have read his letters or reports from the years prior, will stand the test of time. This plan was similar to a proper siege of a fortress, but on a much greater scale, connecting all the preceding systems in due time. The chief defence of the mountaineers was not in the middle of the land, but along in its circumference. The frontier line was like a bastion, which we were forced to approach openly as they sheltered behind powerful barriers. The fortresses of the Muras stood on the frontier line, housing a population of hardened warriors, educated by constant warfare and shaped by half a century of struggle into our personal enemies. Most of these obstacles did not exist in the depths of the mountains. Once in the heart of the mountains, local obstacles were equal for the enemy and for us. There was no prearranged means of defence there. The population distant from us and never disturbed was much less belligerent, much less imbued with hatred towards us, and valued their well-being more than the semi-nomadic abreks of the frontier societies. Our main objective was to make a secure path into the midst of the mountains. The first condition for the success of such an enterprise was choosing the best route. Then what remained was to act as in a siege, firmly occupy the incoming roads to the mountains, move forward methodically, dislodge the obstacles hindering us on both sides, stand firmly at select points in the mountains themselves, and then proceed to a rapid offensive with the whole mass of troops, fracturing the enemy's country from the core and forcing the frontier line to fall without resistance. Obviously, according to the very essence of this program, Conquest was to pass through 3 phases: the preparatory period for occupying the proper mount approaches, a period of methodical warfare, and the mountains, and finally the decisive offensive. Yeah, very much feels that Boyatinski is really taking the final conquest quite seriously and treating it as a serious military campaign with the Chechens and Circassians, as a true enemy to be respected and be defeated, and not like the previous war, where it was just kind of like just treated like an uprising, which we can send some spare troops to deal with. This comparison with the siege of the fortress expresses only the general principle of the plan. The outcome depended on correctly selecting the points of interest and operational lines that would decide the success of enterprise quickly and completely. Until then, determining the goal of operations had been a stumbling block in the Caucasian War. It constantly turned out that occupation of the points considered decisive was of no use, and we abandoned them ourselves. In such a congested terrain as that of the Caucasus, this choice is extremely difficult, but in it the skill of the commander is revealed. Ever since Muradism united all the eastern tribes into one nation, the mountain societies had become parts of a single organism that felt all blows received equally. No matter from which side they were dealt, tribal identity had already half melted into a political unity. Subjected to a common authority, moving in crowds from one part of the region to another to protect their borders, and forced to exchange products exclusively among themselves because the foothill region was close to them, the Highlanders, in some manner, became citizens of one state. In such a state of social order, the conquest of significant tribes from one side was bound to reverberate throughout the mountains and shake the courage and confidence of the entire population. The conquest of Dagestan would decide the fate of Chechnya and vice versa. Thus, the choice of a path for the offensive depended primarily on the relative ease with which the second part of the operation, methodical warfare in the mountains, could be accomplished. On the southern side, the unruly population was fenced in by a snowy ridge, where the passes fall for only 3 months in the summer. During the rest of the year, it was impossible for a mass of troops to cross the bridge. When attacking from the southern side, it was necessary to leave the troops without communication for 9 months of the year in the midst of a hostile population. Only quick invasions in summer were possible on the Lesgin line. Expeditions of this kind, as has already been proven long ago, could not conquer the mountaineers. Their troops covered their foothills with familiar ease, advancing on the enemy and gradually exhausting him before the time came for decisive blows. The only choice left for a real offensive was between Dagestan and Chechnya. Decades of expeditions within the borders of unruly Dagestan, from Akulgo to Chok, proved the futility of such attempts. Every village in this country was a Saragossa. We were taking a fortified all at the cost of several thousand sacrifices, only to discover a number of similar aulas requiring the same sacrifices. Dagestan was a nest of Muradism. The spiritual power slavishly subjugated the Dagestani population, mastered the thought and will of its people, and reigned over them unquestioningly. It was impossible to hope to shake the political power of Muradism in this country while it was still standing in its integrity, backed by all the resources of the mountains. Still less could one hope to smash with overt force the wide belt of fortresses and fortified walls that was enclosing Dagestan from our side, while their inhabitants were ready for vigorous defence. The losses would have been so enormous in such a venture and success is now so doubtful that it could not have even been suggested. The Chechens are undoubtedly the bravest people in the Eastern Mountains. The campaigns into their land have always cost us dearly. However, this tribe never quite internalized Muridism. Of all the Eastern Highlanders, the Chechens were the most important in personal and social life, and they had forced Shamil, who ruled despotically in Dagestan, to make 1,000 concessions to them in the way of government, in people's duties, and in the ritual strictness of their faith. Gazavat, war against the infidels, was the only pretext for them to defend their tribal independence and conduct raids. Many thousands of Chechens who had been deposed in 1840 have since resettled with us and enjoyed, under the exemplary administration created for them, a prosperity that tempted their fellow tribesmen. Shamil never trusted the Chechens and did not consider them firmly committed to him. The disintegration of the Mountain Union, founded by Muridism, would most likely begin in Chechnya. Militarily, an offensive in this country was also more convenient. In Dagestan, we encountered resistance at certain points which could not be avoided, while their capture always cost great sacrifices. In Chechnya, both lowlands and highlands, there was almost no place where the enemy could hold out against our onslaught. There it was always one skirmishing action on the move, if only our lines were strong enough to hold the enemy's attack. Having cleared the terrain in certain directions, it was possible to march through Chechnya without firing a shot, and with sufficient force and a methodical mode of action, it is much easier to cut a clearing in the forest occupied by the enemy than to besiege a fortress where the defenders have settled into the death, all the more so because the cleared terrain belongs to us forever. While an all taken is only ours as long as it is occupied, we could reasonably expect that within a certain period of time we would cut through the forest that made up the Chechen strongholds, and having conquered their dwellings, the forces bellicose were not fanatical people to submit, opening access through the land to the very depths of the mountains and thus coming to the rear of the strongholds of the Dagestan border. Comment from Dissident Knight: Dagestanis and smashing very apt. Yeah, and it's very interesting because obviously this region always resented Russian rule somewhat, because obviously in the 90s during the post-Soviet collapse, Chechnya was able to break away as a nominally independent republic for a few years before Putin put an end to that in the early 2000s. Okay. The distribution of troops by divisions was considered in view of the magnitude of the proposed actions. On the right flank and the three military divisions of the Eastern Caucasus, in addition to the line battalions and Cossack troops, there was an infantry division, part of the 21st Battalion, equal in strength with the two divisions now in operation. Of the 13th and 18th Divisions assigned, the first was divided by a brigade between the right flank, which was too extensive for a single division, and the left flank from whence the main offensive was to be launched. The 18th Division remained in the Caucasus as a reserve and available force for roadworks, the necessity of which was indicated by the previous war. In 1859, the 13th Infantry Division returned to its corps and was replaced by the Caucasian Reserve Division. Due to a lack of troops, the Kutaisi General Government would be occupied with only one brigade of line battalions. Despite the extreme importance of this region, covering the entire Caucasus from the Black Sea, and the urgent need to develop it strategically, the military actions were calculated with the above considerations in mind. On the Lesgian line, our detachments were to annually ravage the enemy societies and bring them to exhaustion by the time of the decisive moment. In the Caspian region, it was decided to first occupy Salatavia, but separated Dagestan from the eastern end of the left flank, in order to open the way to the mountains from the northern side and firmly bind the two armies by the time they would have to act together. On the left flank, it was decided to first finish the conquest of the Chechen plain and stand firmly at the foot of the mountains, then to transfer the war to the mountains themselves, which had never yet seen Russian banners, to direct the first blow to the Argon Gorge, and by occupying it up to the Snowy Ridge, to separate Lesser Chechnya from the greater and cut off the whole western corner of the country under the control of Muridism, and finally to move to Ichkeria, where Shamil's residence Vedeno was located, and thereby complete the conquest of the Chechens. When these conquests were accomplished, we would have a firm foot in the depths of the mountains, leaving only Dagestan to Shamil. We should move the whole mass of troops at once and finish the matter of Muridism with a single blow. Such was the military plan of Prince Boyatynsky, which in 3 years solved the 50-year struggle. It was a resolution for which the troops fighting against the mountaineers and Russia at large had long given up hope. The occupation of the plain and the foothills, Greater Chechnya, Ork, and Salatavia, was in fact only a preparatory action. It did not yet give up a clear advantage, but it created a new position for which we could launch a decisive offensive. The period of these preparatory actions covered the fall of 1856 and the whole of 1857. During the first winter from November to April, the troops of the left flank, led by General Yevdokimov, completed the network of clearing in Greater Chechnya begun under Prince Vorontsov in 4 campaigns and opened up this country in all directions, overcoming at every step the strong resistance of the Chechens supported by huge levies from Dagestan. The dense forests were filled in one winter. At the same time, a special detachment operating on the Kimik Plain under the command of General Baron Nikolai cleared the entrance to Ork. The native population, scattered throughout the forests in small farms, remained in their homes, but Greater Chechnya was already like a fortress with its gates breached. Its garrison would have to lay down its arms at the first request. In the summer of 1857, the troops of the left flank did not advance. The operations were to open on the side of Dagestan and the Lesgin line, where the high terrain, covered with snow half the year, is passable only in the summer months. During this time, it was necessary to organise in accordance with the new insights the material situation of the left flank, where the position of fortifications and deployment of troops had got mixed up due to the successive replacement of administrative systems. The regiments of the left flank got to rest for the final time, for embarking on a march which would not end until the last shot rang out in the eastern mountains. The Dagestan and Lesgin detachments entered the mountains almost simultaneously. Adjutant General Prince Orbeliani was to establish a permanent headquarters for one of his regiments in Salatavia in order to connect the Caspian region with the left flank by direct communication and to give the Dagestan detachment a stronghold to advance into the mountains from the northern side. To fulfill this plan, it was necessary to overcome the stubborn resistance of the mountaineers. Salatavia was already flooded with enemy hordes under the personal leadership of Shamil. Prince Orbeliani quickly overcame the first obstacle, the Terengal ravine so many times fruitlessly irrigated with Russian blood, and took a position on the other side near Old Bertunai, recognized as convenient for the establishment of headquarters. The mountaineers, driven from the first position almost without a fight, scattered around the detachment the colorful communications were arranging debris on the road from Bertunai to the Evgenievsko fortification, from which the troops were supplied with food. A column detached from the camp drove them from this position and reopened communications, killing several hundred Murids on the spot. At this point, Shamil occupied an impenetrable forested area 4 kilometers from these headquarters being erected and began to build a fortress on his side, which was to block ours permanently. Prince Orbeliani did not disturb him in his refuge until the autumn, caring only for swift completion of the work undertaken by his own men. When the new headquarters was sufficiently established to receive troops for the winter, our detachment seized the enemy's fortifications in the surprise night movement and scattered them. A Dagestan infantry regiment was firmly established in Salatavia, but the Salatavians who had scattered into the forest were not yet subdued. In the same summer, General Vrevsky crossed the mountain ridge from the Hetty side and in a few weeks devastated most of the powerful Didoy community, burning alls and trampling the crops. This was the only possible course of action on the Lesgin line. It was not intended to conquer, but only to weaken the mountaineers and secure our borders. Exorbitant labour associated with the march to the highest impassable part of the Caucasus and the impossibility of carrying sufficient food always reduced the term of the campaign on the Lesgin line and made it no more than a big raid. Distracted by Salatava affairs, Shamil left the defence of this part of the region to local forces, resulting in the weak resistance of the enemy. A few Didoy held on in their towers and perished. Toward the end of the campaign, when our troops began their return journey, Shamil's son, Ghazi Muhammad, came to the rescue of the devastated region with a strong horde and tried to bypass our detachment. However, repulsed on the very first step, he was forced to watch motionlessly from the heights as our troops departed, leaving only ruins behind them. The Didoy population, driven to extremes, had to spend a brutal winter without shelter and food, living on handouts from neighbouring societies. But hope for the future was not yet sufficiently shaken in the souls of the mountaineers. No one came to us from this distressed mass. Muridism had so firmly united the social structure of the Highlanders that for a whole year, from the fall of 1856 to the fall of 1857, in the course of inflicting on them a whole series of defeats and occupying locality after locality, we had not yet subdued a single person, but resolve of the societies over which our blows fell most severely was already wavering, especially in Chechnya, which was less fanatical than the other tribes. With the opening of the winter operations, the turning point of the war began. General Yevdokimov was to make the first step into the mountains during the winter by occupying Argun Gorge, but this campaign could be made only on the condition that there was no enemy in the rear of his advancing troops. The invasion of the mountains had to be preceded by a perfect conquest of the plain. In October 1857, General Yevdokimov suddenly ascended the Goita River into the forest foothills, where the population of Lesser Chechnya lived. Knocked off the plain by the expeditions of General Freytag, after a brief but bloody affair, the mountaineers were dispersed through the forest and their dwellings exterminated throughout the territory between the Goita and Argon rivers. Having cleared the enemy from the right side of the proposed line of operations, General Yevdokimov crossed into the Greater Chechnya and marched towards the Mishik, giving the appearance that all our forces were concentrating against the Michik society. Shamil's hordes flocked to the defences of the Naibstvo. Having convinced them that we were marching on Mishik, General Yevdokimov quickly crossed the Kalikovsky Ridge, joined the Kumyk detachment, and invaded Ork, where access had been open since the previous year. This country was occupied in its entirety before the mountain horde standing on the Michik learned of the purpose of our manoeuvres. The mountaineers now had to dislodge us from our firmly held positions rather than defend their land, a feat beyond their power. The Chechen detachment cut a clearing through the Ork forests and laid the Kishin Ork fortification deep inside them. Having completed this enterprise, General Yevdokimov moves again into Greater Chechnya, constantly separating the Chechen population living north of the great foothill clearing from Shamil's hordes, which he had pushed into the forested mountains to the south. Once in this position, he demanded obedience from the inhabitants of Greater Chechnya. Their country, which had been opened by clearing since the previous year, was accessible from all directions. A Russian army stood between them and the Murids. Exhausted by 17 years of war and almost cold to the cause of the corrective Tarakat, the population of Greater Chechnya submitted and was resettled on the left bank of the Argon. With both sides of the Argon Gorge cleared of the enemy and our rear secure, we could finally enter the mountains in January 1858. General Yevdokimov approached the Argon Gates, where the enemy had concentrated his forces in strong barricades. The battle might have been extremely bloody, but skillful detouring delivered us the mountain fortifications without loss. Having taken possession of the valley formed behind the Argon Gate by the confluence of the two rivers, Chenty Argon and the Sharo Argon, General Yevdokimov laid here a fortification called the Argon Fortification, which was to serve as the initial stage in the conquest of the mountains. The new fortification grew from the snow with unusual speed. With the first four, the main Chechen detachment can move on. To the left of the Argon fortification, from the bank of the Sharo Argon rises the high ridge of Darginduk, covered with dense forest on the slopes but bare at the top. Further on, the ridge connects with the Andean mountains and leads to several high, conveniently passable mountain glades to the rear of Ichkeria and Vedeno. Shamil's capital having completed the fortifications, General Yevdokimov abruptly climbed to the top of the Darginduk, preventing enemy resistance in an area that would have been impassable with sufficient defences. Having taken commanding positions, the Chechen detachment cut through the clearing without a shot, allowing us to free access to this natural mountain road. The Darginduk road accomplished two goals simultaneously. If it was found more advantageous to by passage carrier, it led us to the rear of this country by a convenient road. If it was found better to act in another direction, the danger to which the mountaineers were exposed by the newly opened road still drew their attention and forces to Darginduk, which greatly eased our ventures. As soon as the Chechen detachment returned from the ridge to the Argon Valley, the mountaineers immediately occupied Darginduk in a strong cluster and began to block the road with ditches and fortifications. Leaving them to sit quietly on this perch, General Yevdokimov rushed across the Argon Valley to the rear of the small Chechen Uls, which had been dealt a heavy blow last autumn. This tribe realised its fate and submitted. It could not go farther into the mountains, which were populated by other societies who valued their land. The inhabitants of Greater Chechnya, who had been hiding in the forest foothills for more than 10 years and who had been made incessant raids into our borders from there, were evicted to the former locations between the mountains and the Sunsa. The winter actions of 1857 to 58 ended with the conquest of Lesser Chechnya. The northern plains and foothills were conquered and the entrance to the mountains was opened. With summer began new campaigns deep into the mountains which could crush Buddhism within 15 months. However, despite the bold directions of our troops into the heart of those slums, which were unknown until then and considered inaccessible, these expeditions had to be carried out methodically for another year, developing the terrain at every step and considering as ours only the land on which the enemy could no longer resist. The mountainous alliance, which remained active only at the edges, was only still too strong to be confronted directly. In June, troops were to move into the mountains from all three directions. The Chechen detachment up to the Chanty-Argon Gorge, the Dagestani from Butunai to Michik, threatening to invade Andia, and Lezgin through Kanusha into the inner mountains of Lezgistan, lying east of the Dudoy Society. The main operation was entrusted to the Chechen detachment, which was to occupy the course of the Argun to the Snowy Ridge. The Dagestani detachment carried out only sabotage. The Lezgin detachment, now combined, was to both keep the enemy occupied and continue the enterprise they had begun, the ravaging of the unruly societies of southern Lezgistan. In the meantime, the old Imam, constrained as he had never been before, and finally seeing our true aspirations, endeavoured to renew this means which had been successful for him so many times before, to kindle a popular uprising in our rear. Muridic propaganda set to work among the peaceful population as in the 1840s. But on the side of the mountaineers, there was no longer the same infatuation kindled by good fortune, and the most ardent adherents of the corrective Tarakat did not dare to start an uprising. The Nazran society, which had long been peaceful, though restless and predatory, living near Vladikavkaz, was ordered to settle in large alls, following the example of the Chechens because of the proven impossibility of managing a mountain population scattered in small hamlets. Their spirits ignited by Shimil's agents, the Nazranians became indignant. A joyous clamour answered their revolt in all the mountains. Until then, a spark was enough to start a fire. Shamil, prepared in advance, rushed towards Nazran through Lesser Chechnya, hoping that this tribe, which had just been conquered, would be carried away by the example of its neighbours. But our side also took measures in advance. Columns closely networked around the foothills instantly drew to the point where Shamil came to the plain and pushed him back. At the same time, Nazran was subdued by arms. The movements necessitated by this incident did not slow down a single day of the projected expedition. The Chechen detachment had to conquer the most impregnable terrain, perhaps in the entire Caucasus. Up the Argun lay the rich Chateau Valley, the occupation of which was half the solution, but it was behind a ridge with only one path leading to it, on the right side of a blind gorge dug by the Argun into the highest mountains. One landslide could stop a whole army here, but the mountains and the gorge were clothed with dense forest, without a trail or a road. While the detachment was being assembled, our troops made several demonstrations at the foot of Dargan Duk, finally leaving the mountaineers resigned to the fact that the Russians would take this path. The main enemy horde was positioned above the Dargan Duk clearing, from where it could not reach the Chateau Road in time, but the Shanti Argun Gorge was also occupied by a party of several hundred men, quite sufficient to keep us out. General Yevdokimov led the clearing into the gorge. The mountain naibs were aware of the impossibility of this terrain, took our manoeuvre for a demonstration and became even more vigilant in guarding the Dargan Duk. Waiting until nightfall, General Yevdokimov transferred the detachment to the left bank of the Argun by way of a bridge, secretly arranged in the deep trough of the river, and with dawn rushed for the Chateau Valley, without a road, straight through the forest ridge of Mikenduk. This strategy by the Chechen detachment relied entirely on secrecy and calculation of the time it would take for the mountaineers to cross the Argun and climb a high ridge, because meeting a significant number of the enemy in the Mikenduk forest would have meant a defeat for us. The calculation was correct. Only a few locals put up a struggle, and the head of the detachment had already reached the Varandi clearing when the first panting crowd of mountaineers appeared. The Murids had to return to the gorge without a fight. The main obstacle had been overcome, but behind the detachment lay the Mikenduk forest, through which a road had to be built. For almost an entire month, the Chechen detachment developed a road back through the gorge they had bypassed and forward to the Chateau Valley. In the meantime, our columns entered the mountains from the other directions as well. The Dagestan detachment, led by Adjutant General Baron Wrangel, who had taken the place of Prince Orbeliani, moved towards Mitchik, destroying the blockades that were obstructing access to Andia. General Revsky crossed the Snowy Ridge with the Lezgin detachment and penetrated the lands of the Capuchin Society, while another small detachment operating from the same side moved towards General Yevdokimov on the upper reaches of the Argun. Attacked at once from several sides, the experienced leader of Muridism immediately realized where the main blow was coming from, and leaving his followers in charge at other points, turned to his sons and principal corps against General Yevdokimov. The mountaineers had taken an extremely strong position near the All of Bolshi Varandi, covering the only access to the Chateau Valley. However, Shamil, schooled by experience, no longer trusted strong positions, knowing that further Russian movement inland would lead to, he decided to stop it by invading our borders. Leaving half of his numerous troops at the position in front of Chateau, the Imam rushed with the other half to Vladikavkaz, where he hoped to find allies in the Nazrans with luck. Shamil could take the upper hand over our weak troops there, which would lead to an uprising of the tribes of the entire Central Caucasus who still believed in Muridism. But luck had long since betrayed the old military leader. His brave intention proved to be his undoing. General Yevdokimov, leading a march deep into the mountains, arranged the columns on the plain in such a way that they mutually supported one another and could concentrate on any threatened point. On the same day, Shamil, who had come down to the flat near Vladikavkaz, was defeated by General Mishchenko. General Yevdokimov, taking advantage of the imam's absence, dispersed the hordes occupying the Vandy position and took possession of Chatoy. Shamil was cut off and had to ascend the Argonne almost to the snowy ridge, only to escape home. Right, my voice is really starting to go now, so I think I'll leave it there for this week. So, thank you so much for tuning in, and yeah, next week I'll do a final stream on this while I'll finish reading the section and then do the conclusion at the end. So, yeah, this has been a really fascinating book to read and a topic to explore. So, thank you for everybody who has tuned in. I'm just going to make sure there's not been any super chats. One moment. If anybody's got any questions, now's the time to answer them. Yeah, there's been no super chat. So, so yeah, next week I'll carry us on and get the rest of this book finished. In terms of other streams on the channel, people noticed last Sunday I did a very special stream on the history of the Hashashin, or the Order of Assassins, and I was making some meta-political comparisons between the assassins and the current escalations of political violence in the contemporary West, considering recent events. So, people interested, you can give that a watch. In terms of other streams coming up, I'm hoping to do a stream with Furious Pertinats at some point next month on Belisarius. We're still trying to get a date set in place for that. So there's that to look forward to as well. So thank you everybody for watching, and good night.